At this point, it's useful to think about the different types of data. Up until this point, we've been talking about data very generally, but it comes in different flavors and we can categorize it in different ways. And so let's talk about those now. For me, two useful distinctions are whether the data is actively collected or passively collected, and whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So let me take those distinctions in turn. If we start with actively collected data, that's data where the subject of the data knows that they're providing it. So for example, if you participate in a survey, whether it's an online survey or on the phone or in person, you know you're answering survey questions. You're actively participating in that process. Contrast that with a situation where you might just be driving down the road and a sensor picked up the fact that your car has passed by a certain point and it's collecting that for purposes of traffic management or something like that. Data is still being collected about you, but you might not even be aware that that's happening. Another example of that would be if you're tweeting or something just for your own purposes, but somebody's collecting all of the tweets about a particular subject and analyzing those tweets to find out how many of them are positive or how many of them are negative or something like that. The person who did the tweeting is not conscious that that analysis ever even happened. Another distinction that we can think about is the one between quantitative data and qualitative data. Quantitative data is anything that already starts out as a number, so revenue figures, expense figures, those kinds of things start out as quantitative data. It also includes things that can be easily converted to quantitative data. A really good example of this is if you think about a survey where you might be answering questions on a scale that goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree along 5 points in between those polls. Those can easily be converted from just the words to a 1 through 5, depending on which of those options that you've selected. Contrast that with qualitative data, which might start out as words or images or documents or video or audio. All of those things can be converted to data, but the process, first of all, is harder and more subjective. We've all experienced this when we do CAPTCHA on the internet, when we've been asked to identify all of the pictures of cars or signs or trees or something like that. What that's doing is it's taking those images and converting them to data that we can use the same way that we use quantitative data. For example, this picture either has a tree in it or it doesn't. That one has a sign in it or it doesn't. That's turning it into a quantitative sort of data. But qualitative data is also useful in its own right, even before it's converted to quantitative data. For example, if we think about something where maybe our stakeholders aren't that enthusiastic about us, we could see that result in a survey, get an overall score for how much they approve of what we're doing. But if we get their verbal responses in something like an open-ended survey question or an interview or a focus group or a tweet, we've got a lot more color and understanding for why they answered the way that they did. So when we combine these two dimensions together, we get these four categories that are shown here. We've got actively collected quantitative data. Some common examples of that are things like surveys, experiments, registration data on websites and things like that. Also third-party data. And what I mean by that is it is actively collected quantitative data, but somebody else has done the collecting and we're just using it. Probably the classic example of that is the census data. So the census organization for our country, for example, Statistics New Zealand, has collected data and then we're using that data. Other examples, though, include things like syndicated data, where perhaps a company like Nielsen has collected the data and then is selling it to other parties. These days, there's also a trend toward open data. So somebody might have collected the data for one purpose, but then it's opening it up to anybody else who wants to use that data. We can contrast that with passively collected quantitative data. Examples of that include things like web and app analytics data, so for example, Google Analytics. Operational records, so these would be things like how much inventory we have in this location or sales last week in this outlet. Those things are being recorded just for operational purposes, but we can get that data and analyze it for other purposes as well. Also sensor data, the examples that I gave before with things like traffic. Our cars these days are all collecting data, the modern ones, and passing that information back to the manufacturer, both so that they can tell us when we need service and things like that, and also so that they can improve the cars in the future. If we think about actively collected qualitative data, that would be things like focus groups, interviews, and open-ended survey forms. So in all of these, the person who's providing the data knows that they're doing that. They know that they're sitting in a focus group or an interview or answering a survey question where they're filling in a blank about something. But it is qualitative data in that all of those things are being expressed in words, either verbally or in written form. Common examples of passively collected qualitative data would be things like scraped tweets. So in that case, what somebody is doing is collecting all of the tweets that are on a certain topic or being generated by people from a certain place or something like that, and looking at what are the general themes, what are the people talking about in the tweets, do the tweets tend to be positive, negative, or neutral? Other examples would be things like articles and documents. So we're just collecting all of the articles and documents about a particular topic, and again, doing some of that same sort of analysis to identify themes and sentiment. And similarly with audio and video and images, we're taking those things and we're often categorizing them to find out what do they tend to be about, and possibly to, again, do they tend to be conveying a particular sentiment.